So I am so thankful to have you all here tonight for our fifth installment in the history of Christianity. And what I would like to do tonight is to pick up where we left off and to talk about life in Christian Europe between the years of 800 and 1200. And what does it mean to be a person in Europe during this 400-year period? What does it mean to be a person of faith? And how did Christianity shape the lives of everyday Europeans during this period of time? Because this was a period of time where there was a significant transition in Europe. What is going on? Well, one of the things that's really important to know is that Europe was very much during this period of time shaped by the political situation that existed, and we can't understand Christianity apart from what happened politically. Charlemagne, the great historical figure of this period of time who had done much to unify Central Europe. Charlemagne dies in 814, and what had been a fairly coherent empire during that period of time really began to kind of collapse and fall apart. It was a breakdown in centralized rule, and what came into place in the vacuum created by the disintegration of centralized rule was what we call feudalism. And feudalism was a relationship centered on two individuals, a lord and a vassal. It was a component, a relationship between two folks. And the Lord, whether it be a king or whether it be somebody in the next level of authority that you see here on this map listed as the nobles, these folks were in positions of power. And the person in the relationship in the inferior position was the vassal. And so if you were a vassal, if you were a noble, you would swear your allegiance to a king. If you were a knight, you would swear your allegiance to a noble. This was a swearing of military support. This was a swearing of economic support. This was a swearing of legal support. This was a swearing of political support. And in return, what the Lord, or the upper position in this relationship, what he gave was land, a fief or a fiefdom. And this land then could be used by the vassal to support the vassal. And this is a male-dominated society in which these relationships were almost always between men. Men were vassals and men were lords. And this system replaces the centralized administration that had existed under Charlemagne. And this relationship had lots of flexibility in it. Some vassals were themselves very powerful individuals who simply owed allegiance to the next person up in the food chain. Other vassals were folks who were very low down and who really were utterly dependent on their lord in order to survive. And so if you were a vassal, when the Lord called you to his court, you went. When the Lord came to his lands, you provided hospitality. Conversely, if you were the Lord, you provided protection. You provided legal protection. You provided military protection. And you were essentially responsible for the survival of the folks who lived on your land. So ultimately, even if you were at the very bottom of this pyramid, if you were a peasant, the minimum that feudalism guaranteed you was that you would never starve to death, that your feudal lord ultimately would be responsible for your survival. And at the same time that feudalism exists, this other economic institution also came into existence, and this is known as Menorialism. And this is this really has to do with time and the necessity for time. So if you are one of these feudal lords who exist in these two levels right here, if you're a noble person who owes allegiance to a king, or if you're a knight who owes allegiance to a noble person, you cannot spend all of your time providing for your own food. You need to train, you need to fight, you need to govern. And what comes out of this is the creation of individuals at the very bottom of society who were serfs. So a manor, with an O here, a manor is simply an agricultural estate that is operated by a feudal lord and provides food not just for the serfs themselves, but these serfs are essentially the economic engine, the agricultural engine that drive the rest of the economy. Now, for some of us in this virtual room here tonight, some of us can remember when there were family farms in Kentucky, and family farms of 30 or 50 or 400 or 500 acres. These family farms would grow the corn or the wheat or the other food products that were necessary to feed Kentuckians, or they would grow a cash crop like tobacco that could be sold to provide income to buy food products. Now, in most places in the United States, where I'm from in Arkansas, family farms don't really exist as much anymore. Most of the arable land is owned by big corporations. And so you'll have somebody like Monsanto or Prudential Life Insurance who will own hundreds of thousands of acres, and food is produced at an industrial scale. Here it's much more produced by these small manors that simply produced the food that was necessary for people to eat. And this comes out of ancient Rome. Within the ancient Roman practice, there were these large farms that existed outside of urban areas in the country. And so this is not a new concept, but the idea that these serfs are essentially tied to the land. They're not slaves. They're not human beings who are owned as property. But they are sort of nonetheless, through this feudal relationship, tied to a particular piece of land. And you also have hundreds of thousands of free European folks who surrender their freedom over time, particularly in the 800s and 900s, surrender their freedom and voluntarily become serfs, because in doing so, they guarantee themselves and their progeny a place to live and food. And so these entities, these two situations are what exist economically. Now, if you are one of these peasants during this period of time, you live a fairly dull life. It is a tough life. You are going to live not by an arbitrary clock, but you are going to live by the agricultural clock. You are going to live by when it is time to plant and when it is time to harvest. You are going to live by the necessity of growing enough grains, primarily carbohydrates, to stay alive. This is at a time when new planting techniques are coming into existence, like a 3-crop rotation where you have corn in one field and wheat in another, and the third field is fallow or unused, and then the next season you rotate them, and so what was wheat becomes corn, and what was fallow becomes wheat, and what was corn is now fallow, and then you rotate again the next year. So we see that. We see the creation of a heavy wooden plow, a karakuka, that would later on lead to a metal plow that allows the soil to be broken up. Remember, again, those of you who've ever had to clear a field, we're talking about forest land where your trees have to be cut down, and then the stumps have to individually be removed, and you don't have a John Deere and you don't have dynamite. You're doing it just with human muscle and animal muscle. And crops are planted in the spring and they're harvested in the fall, and meat, the protein is generally harvested in the fall and either pickled or dried or cured. So it's a tough life. And although they don't know why, even in this period of time, even in the Middle Ages, people knew that if you drank the water, you got sick. You came down with a case of the trots. And so the way you work around that is you drink beer, because beer has just a low enough or just a high enough alcohol content to kill the little creepy crawlies in it. So you've got a diet that is primarily heavy, thick, whole grain bread and liquid bread, beer, with not a lot of variation in between. And one of the things that is going to give life meaning, one of the things that's going to help to break up the monotony of living in this kind of world is religion. And we can talk about religion from theological perspectives. We can talk about religion from philosophical perspectives, but the reality was here for a lot of these very poor folks, religion simply broke up the monotony. It gave you something to center your life on other than the drudgery of getting up and going to work every day. And so, for example, if you were in a field, if you were a peasant working in a field and you were within earshot of a monastery, every time the bells of the monastery would ring and these monks would be called to prayer, and monks were praying every 2 or 3 hours all through the day, you would stop and say a prayer. You'd sort of step away from the plow and you would cross yourself and you would say a prayer in a kind of spiritual union with the monks who were behind the walls, maybe 3 or 4 miles away on the hilltop. You would go to worship at your local parish church. Now, you may not understand anything that's going on, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but from the time your children would be baptized to the time that they would be buried, and certainly on festival days throughout the year, feast days, the church and the life of the church broke up the monotony of life. We as Protestants, we know at least 2 saints' days. We know St. Patrick's Day and we know St. Valentine's Day. And these days were not the day the saint was born, they were the day the saint died. And so you end up with these saints' days, and eventually, of course, the calendar gets filled. Every day of the year is the death day of some saint or another. But again, it's an opportunity to break the monotony, an opportunity to step away from the drudgery of life. And even if you weren't fully cognizant of what it meant, to experience the presence of God in your life one way or another. One of the things that complicated this, and certainly if you travel if you've ever had the chance to travel to Europe today, one of the things that complicates much of this is the fact that within cities, this relationship between lord and vassal operated differently. Oftentimes, cities were places where this relationship was interrupted, and cities oftentimes acted as independent entities. And oftentimes in cities, certainly there was power among the civil officials, but there was also a great deal of power in the hands of the bishop, who would be literally in the cathedral, in the chair in the church that the bishop occupied as the primary church for that diocese. And so a lot of times within these cities would negotiate a charter of liberties with the local feudal lord, and he would oftentimes have much less authority within a city over guilds and over educated folks, over the inheritance and the selling of property, over military obligations, over the right of folks. If you were a peasant or a serf and you went into a city and you lived there for a year and a day, your relationship as a serf ended. You were now a free person. It was a kind of underground railroad to freedom. And so these cities, whether they were little places or whether they were someplace like Venice, which by the year 1300 has 100,000 people. London has 40,000 people. Ghent in Belgium has 30,000 people. Now, these are not large cities compared to places like Constantinople or Baghdad or Damascus, which were huge during this period of time, but certainly they are the anomaly, and they're one of the ways that bishops were able to hold on to religious power. One other thing that's going on at the same time that all of these other things are happening, and it is not linear, it's not cause and effect, it's very much all of these things shaping and affecting one another, is this idea that we've all heard of chivalry, the chivalric code. If you were a feudal lord, if you were in a position of economic or political power, you practiced, and I don't have this word up here, but you practiced primogeniture, which means that all of your earthly goods, all of your wealth, your land, your gold, your currency, the contracts that were due you, all of your earthly wealth would go to your firstborn son. And so if you were a second or third or fourth born male child, you weren't going to inherit any of daddy's wealth. So the path for you is one of the things we talked about a couple of weeks ago is life in the church. Another path for success would, once you turned the age of 21, would be to become a knight. And these ceremonies, you can see that this image here that's quite stylized from art. This is it very rarely looked like this, but nonetheless, this was a ceremony that was steeped in religion. When you would pray through the night, you would don a white garment, you would bathe much as the church used to do during its early years for candidates for baptism. And then you would take an oath. You would swear to protect the church. You would swear to protect widows and orphans and the weak, and to treat captives as honored guests, and to attack only someone who was armed themselves, and to fight not just for violence or for gain or for booty, but to fight only for the glory of God. And so this chivalric code is also something that certainly gave young men an opportunity to do something with all of their free time, to practice in these tournaments, these mock battles. It was a way to demonstrate valor or skill. And of course, if you were a female born into one of these aristocratic families during this time, you were very much under the control of your father and then your husband. So this was a male-dominated society. Now, what starts to happen with all of this stuff as the background, what starts to happen during this 400-year period is that there is a breakdown among the clergy in particular. So by the year 800, essentially, almost all of Europe had been converted to Christianity. And so I'm going to go back just to this little map here. Almost all of the Nordic countries, modern day Finland and Norway and Sweden, the British Isles, Denmark, Eastern Europe, all of these parts of Europe had been converted into Christianity. But the rise of feudalism really complicates these relationships, the relationships between bishops and clergy, the relationship between bishops and feudal lords, the relationship between priests and local feudal lords, the relationship between bishops and the Pope and kings. Sometimes bishops were called upon to provide military support, or to provide political support, or to provide economic support to the feudal lords who owned the land that overlay the diocese. You know, if you're in the Diocese of Lexington, the diocese doesn't own all of the land, but the authority of the diocese overlays the land that's owned by private individuals. And so even in Rome itself, the Pope was oftentimes at the mercy of the local political authorities. And so what you have is a kind of entanglement that leads to, and is also itself worsened by, spiritual and religious breakdown. Discipline, with a little d, really was on the decline. And the teaching of the church during this period of time was that priests were to remain celibate. And the definition of celibacy is not to marry, so to be single. That's what celibate means. The word chaste, C-H-A-S-T-E, that means not sexually active, and that's assumed if you're celibate that you're also not sexually active. But celibacy itself is remaining, living as an individual. Priests were supposed to do this, but there were priests all across the Christian world that were getting married. There was also another practice going on that was called simony. And simony is the selling of church offices. And so, for example, if you've ever traveled to Europe and you go into a large church, you might notice that in addition to the nave of the church, in addition to the long central open space, on the side are little cubbies, little chapels. And so while there may not be worship going on in the nave of a church at any given time, there may be a priest in one of these little chapels. And what would often happen during this period of time is somebody would be appointed, maybe by the bishop or maybe by a political official, appointed as the pastor of one of these chapels. And that pastor would skim off the top. This was a way of making money. You also had individuals who would lobby either in Rome or with local political officials to be appointed as a bishop in a place, because this was a way of having power and having influence and having money. And so what you just have a great deal of corruption in terms of the purity of what it means to be a part of the church, the purity of what it means to be a leader in the church. And so what begins to happen in the early 900s are efforts at reform. Now, these reforms take place in many different ways, in many different locations. And one can argue that as early as the 800s, one could argue that this is really the beginning of the capital R Reformation, that it doesn't have to wait for Martin Luther. But one of the reforms takes place in the French city of Cluny. Now, before everybody's heart starts to flutter, you'll see here that this is spelled different than George, right? The woman who directs the childcare at my congregation at Lafayette, we have a childcare that serves about 120 kids. The woman who directs the childcare in my congregation, I'm not going to out her here. I'll just tell you her first name. Her name is Angie. Angie grew up in Maysville, and Angie's date to the senior prom was George Clooney. So, you know, and there's just, you know, as I tell my students, wherever you find yourself on the spectrum of human sexuality, he's just scrumptious. There's just no way around this. And so you just kind of have to acknowledge that, and then you move on. So in this place called Cluny, the local Lord, William of Aquitaine, in the year 910, established a new monastery, the monastery at Cluny. It was a Benedictine monastery. They followed the rule of Benedict that we talked about last week. And over time, this effort to clean up the behavior of monks, to be much more intentional in following Benedict's rule, this began to spread, and other smaller monasteries that looked to Cluny, that held their allegiance to Cluny and to the abbot of Cluny. These monasteries began to pop up across Europe. It becomes known as the Cluneic System. And so in a way, this is one of the examples of reform not coming from the top, not coming from Rome and being dictated by the Pope and spreading down to the monasteries. This is really a much more organic, a kind of bottom up from the grassroots, where you have monasteries themselves seeking reform. And this eventually leads to officials at the highest levels of the church seeing the value of this reform and reforming themselves. In 1049, the Pope, Leo IX, began a series of reforms to streamline the way the church itself operated, and also to root out misbehavior. One of the things that Leo did is he created the Office of Cardinal. In fact, if you were paying attention to the news, the current Pope Francis just last week named 21 new cardinals to what's called the College of Cardinals. And 16 of the 21 that he named are under the age of 70. And if you are a cardinal under the age, 80. If you are a cardinal under the age of 80, you get to vote for the next pope. only one of these men was an American. The Archbishop of San Diego was named a new cardinal. But these cardinals, this office was created by Pope Leo, and the Office of Cardinal was created as a kind of administrative office within the church, an office at the level between bishops and between the Pope himself. And eventually, by 1059, the church makes it policy that it is the cardinals who will select the next pope. And that is the practice today. When Francis dies, his successor will be selected by a conclave of cardinals. Leo also banned priests who were married, or priests who the evidence showed were sexually active. He simply stripped them of being priests. He also tried to clean up the church by removing any priest or bishop or official who had come into his office through simony. One of the other things that was going on, though, that Leo had to start to come to terms with was this idea known as lay investiture. And this was simply not something that was going to fix itself. This practice was when local kings or local lords would appoint a priest living under their geographic influence, would appoint him as bishop, and then would have essentially a vassal, somebody who they could control. And they would simply send word, down to Rome. I am the feudal lord of Schnitzelgruppen, and I have named Leodosius as the new bishop. And of course, the church hadn't chosen the bishops. The local lay folks had. They had gone through this process of investiture. And so you get this back and forth. Today, again, if you've paid attention to modern Catholicism, this still happens in China. The Chinese government determines who Catholic bishops are in China. And essentially what the Vatican does is just kind of steps back. And you will often hear, I know John Paul did it. I'm sure it's happened under the papacy of either Benedict or Francis, but what they will do is these popes will name bishops in China on their own that the government hasn't vetted, but they won't name them. They'll select them, but they won't speak their names in public. They'll say it's in pectora, in the heart. And so in order to protect this person's life. So the church will have bishops in China that it has selected, that it considers its spiritual leaders, but the government doesn't know who they are, because the government essentially selects or tries to select the bishops on its own that it believes will be amenable to their policies. So this practice of lay investiture starts under the papacy of Leo. It continues under the papacy of Gregory VII, who became a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he wanted to deal with these issues. This became known as the Investiture Controversy, where Gregory in Rome simply got into a pretty serious conflict with one of the local German kings, Henry IV. And of course, if you're a king, if you're in a position of being able to name the bishops in your area, in your kingdom, you don't want to let this go, because it's a way you can hold power. It's a way you can have influence. It's a way, in some cases, you can get your grubby mitts on some of the church's money. And Gregory really pushes Henry. In fact, in the late 1090s, Gregory actually sends an army, Henry sends an army down to Rome, and Gregory has to flee the city. But eventually, as you see here, the date on this stained glass window, in the year 1122, the German kings and the Pope sign a document, the Concordat of Worms, not Worms as we want to pronounce it, but it's the German city of Worms, which is going to come up again in Martin Luther's story. And under the Concordat say, we will allow the church to select the bishops. We will not determine who the bishops are. Now, the church consults the nobles. What do you think of this, folks? They kind of allow the nobles to vet a list, but the bishops are chosen by the Pope, and then the bishop, once he is chosen, he pays homage to the king and acknowledges the king as the governmental and secular authority within that location. And so this was a kind of rapprochement where the two sides within the controversy could compromise. Now, one last significant change that came during this period of time, as the 1100s began, came under Pope Urban II. And Urban helped create a church legal system. This is known as the Curia. And essentially, and I touched on this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, the Curia is the entity. It's a bureaucracy that essentially administers church law. That is, how is the church going to handle property? How is the church going to handle marriages? How is the church going to handle inheritance, right? You know, we touch on that a little bit in our Protestant free churches. I'm just going to ask a question here. David, is Central Christian Church incorporated?
Yes.
All right. And I'm guessing you did that for legal reasons.
Yes.
Yep. And do you all have trustees?
Yes.
All right. And so if I fall down and go boom on the front steps of Central Christian Church and I have a boo-boo and I call the hammer, he's going to sue the trustees, or is he going to sue the corporation? He's going to go after somebody. But hopefully Central has tied all of its bows and crossed all of its T's and dotted all of its I's so that the entity is protected. David's not going to be eating dry dog food for the rest of his life. You all aren't going to simply have to close up because you get sued by the hammer. And so within the Catholic Church, that whole legal system is much more developed. There is an entire church legal system, and that is created during this time by Urban. And so Urban also begins to be the first of the popes, and this is certainly taken by his successors, to use the power of the church to achieve his goals. Now, again, if you've been paying attention to the American political scene in any way, shape, or form, you know, for example, that last week, the Archbishop of San Francisco denied communion to the Speaker of the House based on her her political views related to human reproduction and reproductive rights, because he said her political views clashed with the teachings of the church, and therefore she couldn't take communion. She was excommunicated. That's what it means, literally, to not be able to share communion. And so one of the ways that popes could leverage political power, one of the ways that bishops could leverage political power was to excommunicate someone. So, for example, if you are king, if Ken is the king of Nicholasville, and Ken does something that the bishop does not like, the bishop can say to Ken, I'm excommunicating you. I'm cutting you off from the sacrament of communion, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Now, if Ken is a deeply faithful follower of Christ, and if he sees the sacrament as his primary connection to God and to the church, this is a deep and serious wound for Ken. And to excommunicate somebody may well, in fact, be the way that church authorities can get somebody to behave. I'm gonna cut you off. I'm going to prevent you from having communion and having a relationship with God until you behave in the way that I want you to behave. Now, if Ken is not necessarily somebody who has a deep and abiding faith, if he understands the power structure of the world around him, but he's not somebody who is nourished by communion or is fed by the worship experience, he may just say, right? I don't care if you cut me off, that's fine. Do whatever you feel like you've got to do, right? But the Pope or the bishop here has an extra ace up his sleeve, and this is the interdict. And so, picking on Ken here, if Ken is the king of Nicholasville, and he doesn't care whether he's excommunicated or not, what the bishop can do then with the Pope's authority is issue an interdict and say, okay, nobody in Ken's kingdom gets communion. Everybody gets cut out. Now, Ken may not give a dang whether he gets communion or not, but when all of the folks with the pitchforks and the lighted torches show up at Ken and Jan's house or castle, right? You have prevented us from having communion. You have prevented us from baptizing our children. You have prevented us from burying our dead. Because of your behavior, the church has cut off access to the sacraments to all of us. Now that is a really powerful weapon. That's an incredibly powerful weapon. And so what you see here is Urban and the popes that have followed him have really figured out how you can use the system, right, to achieve your goals, right? You know, if for whatever reason Central Christian Church began to behave in a way that Mayor Gordon didn't like, Mayor Gordon can't close Central Christian Church down. But what if she decided to put sawhorses up on every street around Central and say, oh, we're having sinkhole issues? She could squeeze the church. She could certainly, do that. And that's essentially what an interdict does here. An interdict cuts off, as you see in this poor image here in this painting, it cuts off the people of the kingdom from the sacraments. And that is a very effective way to create political unrest and instability and change the leadership if the leadership's not doing what you want it to do. So let me just talk finally about the sacraments. And this really goes back to what I talked about earlier with everyday religion. If you are one of these peasants, if you are just a member of the largest societal group in Europe during this time, if you're just a serf, and you go to church, you're going to go to worship where a priest speaks every bit of the worship service, every bit of the liturgy with the exception of the sermon or the homily, every bit of the liturgy is delivered in Latin. And by this time, you really don't speak Latin. You speak whatever Proto-German or Proto-French or Proto-English. You speak whatever language is the language of your location. That's what you speak. In this, we all read the Canterbury Tales in high school, and that's that's sort of about as close as you can get. If you've ever, you all have had several classes with Jerry Simony. When Jerry takes a class to the Holy Land, when he takes a class to Greece to visit, he has to bring a translator. And I said, well, you speak Greek? And he says, no, I don't. He said, I can read it. He said, I speak Koine Greek. I speak the Greek that was spoken by Jesus and his contemporaries 2,000 years ago. And that's about as close to modern Greek as English was 2,000 years ago to the English we speak today, which is not very close at all. So, so the way you connected to God was really through the sacraments. And the sacraments were how most people experienced God. Now, you've heard, if you know about sacraments today, you know that there's 7. But there's one sacrament that did not exist during this period of time. And then there's one sacrament that really does not apply to everyday religion. So the 2 sacraments that are missing from this list that you might be familiar with, the first is the Sacrament of Confirmation. And that exists today in the Catholic Church, in the Episcopal Church, in the Methodist Church. That's the moment at which young folks who've reached the age of decision-making affirm their baptism. The other of the 7 sacraments that certainly didn't have an effect on most folks is ordination. So what that leaves are the other 5, and they are baptism, marriage, the Eucharist or communion, penance, and what was called extreme unction or the last rites. So when a child was born, that child was baptized. Oftentimes, probably in most cases by a priest, but Catholic theology says that any Christian can baptize any other Christian. And so because there was confusion on the part of a lot of folks about the salvific nature of baptism, and if you think there's not confusion about it now, go to worship at one of our cousins' congregations in the non-instrumental churches of Christ who believe in the salvific action of baptism. Right? There are Christians today who believe, if Susie walks down the aisle on a Sunday and Susie says, "I accept Jesus as my Savior," and then Susie falls over dead from a heart attack before Susie's baptized, too bad, pack for warm weather, because you didn't get baptized. You didn't undergo that act that is saving in and of itself. So there's a real sense that you baptize children as soon as they're born, particularly if they're sick, so that they don't spend eternity in hell. And later on, the church kind of goes back and forth with this, and the church finally ends up talking about a place called limbo. So the second of the sacraments is marriage, and this is really the period of time when marriage itself becomes a sacramental act. Because throughout European history, up until this 400-year period, for the most part, marriage was a civil act. It was a contract. Marriage did not have a religious overlay to it. And so now you get this, you get the church moving from, well, we recognize marriages and we celebrate marriages, to the church then saying, okay, we're going to say that marriage is a sacrament, that God is present and participatory in this act. Now, of course, once you do that, once you say this act of marriage between, and it would have been a husband and a wife and God, right? This act is a holy sacramental act. If there's a divorce, then you've got to say, well, what do we do? How do you work backwards if you've now dictated that God is part of it? And that's a story for another day. But the sacramentalization of marriage is important. The third, and probably the most important of these sacraments, is the Eucharist, which is a Greek word that means thanksgiving. And this is communion. This is the moment. And again, this goes back to this idea of apostolic succession that we talked about before. And Jan probably can talk about this with much more integrity and much more authority than I can. When a Catholic priest is ordained and the bishop lays his hands on the head of that priest, the bishop is physically transferring to that priest the apostolic power to transubstantiate the host when that priest celebrates Mass. And so when that individual who is now ordained as a priest stands at the table and says, may these gifts become for us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the priest will make the sign of the cross over the elements, and at that moment they transubstantiate. The substance of those changes into the body and the blood of Jesus. And so for the church, when you go to Mass, when you receive communion, you are following Jesus's literal words: "Eat my flesh and drink my blood." Now, of course, we've grown up steeped in this. My wife, who teaches at Lexington Catholic, every year has international students, particularly students from Asia, that just are completely bumfuzzled by this. This idea that you drink the blood and eat the flesh of your God. This is just completely alien to them. But it is the center of worship for Christians. The fourth of these sacraments is penance. That is the confession of one's sins to a priest, and the priest as the authority figure granting you forgiveness. It's no longer called penance, it's now called reconciliation. And I tell you what, having grown up as a Protestant and having grown up steeped in the idea of the priesthood of all believers, I see it happen. And so I think I've shared with you all, my wife teaches at Lexington Catholic for many years. She was the chair of the religion department. And that meant it was her job every year to be in charge of the worship service, where all of the students come together and have the opportunity to go through reconciliation. So it's this huge worship service across the street at Mary Queen of the Holy Rosary Church. You've got 800 kids that come into this service, and she would have about 20 priests, and they would be stationed all around the rim of the room. And she would ask 4 Protestant clergy. She was always real intentional. She would try to get 2 women and 2 men. And because, I'm the husband, I'm just there with a ring through my nose. She would say, "Oh, well, you're going to be one of them." And so I would get pulled into this service. And she said, "I want you to wear a robe and I want you to wear a stole." And when they make this announcement, they say to the kids, if you're Roman Catholic, you're urged to go to one of the priests. And if you're Protestant and you feel moved to do so, there are Protestant clergy around the sides of the room, right? I'm going to get upset talking about this. So these Protestant kids who don't know what they're doing, right? Some of them get up and they come over to you and they say, I don't know why I'm here. And some of them will just sit there, and then others will sit down and they'll just break down in tears. And sometimes they'll just sit there and cry. And sometimes they'll say, "I just need tell somebody this. I just need to get this off my chest. And they'll talk in very deeply emotional ways. And so, you know, even as somebody who's grown up in the tradition of, I don't need an intermediary between me and God, it was pretty humbling to be that intermediary, or to be seen as that intermediary. But for me, it was much more humbling to be seen as the mechanism or the means by which this child was able to cleanse themselves, which was just really a powerful moment. And finally, the last of the sacraments is unction, or the last rites. And again, today, not called that today, it's almost always referred to as the anointing of the sick. Again, we as Protestants, David, I don't know if you've ever done an anointing. I've done a couple in hospital rooms for folks that have requested it. Again, it's a very powerful moment for not just the person who's being anointed or the person who's doing the anointing, but for the family, because it has such deep biblical roots, this idea of anointing the sick. And, you know, within the Catholic tradition, this is simply a sacramental way of kind of putting a closing, a closing ceremony on the experience of human life. It has nothing to do with salvation. It has nothing to do with where this person's soul is going to go. It's simply a way of the church saying goodbye and allowing the family and the participant to say goodbye as well. And so it's really during this period of time between about 8 and 1200 that we see the church really begin to gel around these 5 sacraments, and how for both ill and for good, they really have a tremendous effect on the lives of everyday Christians. And again, I want to apologize for the difficulty we had at the beginning, but I'm glad we were able to get together. I'm going to look here and see. I see that there's one. Was there a possibility to move up the pyramid? You know, that's a really interesting question, and my answer would be almost always no. The one way that you could move up the pyramid, the one escape, was to move into a city. That's what happened to Martin Luther's parents. Martin Luther's parents were essentially peasants who had the opportunity to live in a city. And if you live in a city for a year and a day, you become a free person. And while it was not common by any stretch of the imagination, there was much more of a degree of upward mobility in cities, just like there is today. You know, I mean, you know, there's a reason why all of our kids want to get the heck out of here and move to Atlanta. So, and so you could go up, but you're very much like one of these salmon in a nature documentary. You're really pushing against the current when you're able to do that.
Okay. All right. Well, Bruce, thank you. Thank you for leading us through this and taking us to the eve. Well, within a few hundred years of the Reformation.
Almost there. Well, not as advertised, but we did what we could.
Hey, speaking of coming back to that, we will take a break for the summer and have new classes announced for the fall. But I will tell you, and you will hear about this, and it'll be communicated. We will have one night special 3D class in 3 weeks on June the 21st at 7 p.m. And the theme is creation care.
Oh, wonderful.
Bill Clary, who is a member of our congregation, made a presentation to our youth on a Sunday morning in early April, and I thought it was just outstanding. As accessible and comprehensive an overview of the themes of creation care in a half hour as I have ever heard.
Wow.
And I said, Bill, this deserves a larger audience. So it will be a 1 evening, 1 hour presentation.
Great.
Open to everyone, and you all will be getting word about that. But that is the that will be one special one night, June 21.
Great. Well, I will look forward to sharing that with my congregation. I know I have folks that would be very much interested in that. And that sounds like if I'm able to, I don't know what my schedule is then, but I would love to link in, assuming that all heck doesn't break loose again. That sounds great.
Yeah, that's true. Everyone, let me stop the recording here. I'm going to